Okay, so thanks for participating. Servlet Basics II, second part of Servlet presentation. So these are the set of topics that we are going to cover. So last week we covered some basics of Servlet. Here we are going to talk about still basics, but the second part of the basics. So we are going to look into Servlet response, which is represented by HTTP Servlet response class. So what is servlet response? Basically, it contains data passed from the servlet to client, meaning it is the one that actually sent to the client. All servlet responses implement servlet response interface. So basically, you can retrieve an upstream, and you can indicate the content type that's sent to the client, indicate whether to buffer output, or you can set the localization information. Now, servlet response is a bit generic, and HTTP servlet response is extension of servlet response. So basically, HTTP servlet response understand HTTP response status code, and also have understanding on concept of cookies. So this picture, when the HTTP request comes in, servlet will be able to servlet 1 handles it, and then it can forward it to servlet 2. Servlet 2 handles it. Servlet 2, after some processing, it might forward it to servlet 3, and servlet 3 in this case create a response, send it to the clients. So response will contain HTTP status code. It contains headers and the body as expected. So this servlet could actually send the response directly to the client instead of forwarding the request to the servlet 2. So here it is assumed that servlet 1, 2, 3 are actually working in unison in chain actually to handle this request, but obviously a single servlet can handle the request as well. So response structure has status code, response headers, and response body as expected. Now let's take a look at the status code in HTTP response. So this is standard status code on HTTP. So why do we need HTTP response status code? Basically, we can ask the client. Well, actually, we can ask the client to go to another page, basically indirection. Indicates a resource is missing. This is like a 4.4 error. So when you go to a page that is not existent, then you get 4.4 error indication. Instruct the browser to cache copy. So you can do all these things using HTTP response status code. So these are the methods for setting HTTP response status code. So you can call set status, and then you provide the status code integer value. Okay, so status codes are defined in HTTP servlet response, and status codes are numeric, fall into 5 general categories. So from 100 to 199 is informational. 200, I'm sure you have seen 200 successful case. 200 range is successful. 300 and 399 is redirection, and 404 is incomplete. So 44 error certainly belongs here, and from 500 it means there is some error on the server side. So default status code is 200. So this is an example of HTTP response status. So this is a success case. In that case, it returns 200 as HTTP status. So common status code. So 200 means success, and basically it's a success. And the 204 success but no response body, and browser should keep displaying previous documents. So these are basically some common status code, but the more common status code you probably see is 4.4. This is just for reference purpose for you, okay? So you don't really have to memorize all this. Okay, so methods for sending error. So error status code 400 to 599 can be used in send error method. So you can either send, you can call send error with the error code, or you can also specify the message. So the way that you are going to set status and send error is basically calling one of those two. So these are examples. So here, when file not found exception occurs, then I set the status to SC not found, and then here I'm also sending response body to the output stream. So this is the same thing as, by the way, like a sending error like this. Alright, so let's do our first demo. So we are setting the error. So we are going to run response send error application. So this is the one. So let's see the code. So here we are all dealing with the servlets. Okay, so we have the greeting servlet Java and greeting servlet 2 Java and response servlet Java. So let's run this application first. When you run the application, so in this code, you are going to see the first page displaying some form field. You're entering the name of a person, and if you do not enter anything, that is an error condition that we capture, and then we are going to send an error. Okay. So it's going to actually start the Glassfish server. So while it's actually starting, let's understand the code. So we have greeting servlet, the Java file. So this is basically displaying these HTML page. Okay, so my name is Duke, what is your name? And it also have a form method. Okay, and so this is what okay, so hello, my name is Duke, and what's yours? So you're going to type something like this and then submit, and like this. However, if you don't submit anything, okay, then you get this HTTP status 500 and you did not enter your name exception. Okay, so let's see the code that we have written. So the first servlet is displaying this, okay, so that you can enter some values, okay, and then it's actually sending the action to greeting 2. So if you take a look at the web.xml file, in this case we have 3 servlets. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at that in XML file. So greeting servlet 2, and response servlet. Okay, so it does handle corresponding greeting. The first one handles /greeting. The next one is handling greeting 2, and third one is response. So if you take a look at the first one, basically it displays the first page, and then when user enters something, it will send to greeting 2. And this greeting 2 URL pattern will be mapped to greeting servlet 2. Okay, based on what we just have seen web.xml file. So greeting servlet 2 is basically checking whether the value that was entered, so it's going to get the username parameter, and then it's going to check whether username is null or not. Okay, if it is null, then we are going to send 500. So this is the code that we are looking for. So we are going to call send error method of response object, and here we are setting 500, and we also specify the message that gets displayed. So you did not enter your name. Okay. All right. So moving forward. Header in HTTP response. So these are standard HTTP headers. Okay, so for example, give forwarding location, specify cookies, supply page modification date, and things like that. So these are common things. I mean, these are the things that typical HTTP response headers deal with. Okay. Since this course is not really trying to understand HTTP response headers, we are going to move on. So Servlet API provides method for setting arbitrary response headers. So you can say set header and header name as header value, set date header and hint header, and you know, a few add header, date header, and things like that. So you know, just understand that there are some methods that you can call to set the headers. You don't really have to remember all this. So set content types. You can set the content type, content length. You can add cookie and send redirect. So this is indicating to the client to redirect to different location. Location specifies the document new location. Use send redirect instead of setting this directory. So this is not really recommended to be used. Instead, you want to use send redirect. You can refresh, and you can also set cookies. Okay, but again, you use add cookie instead, the add cookie method, instead of setting it directly. Excuse me. Okay, so there are a few more response headers again. These are for your references, so I'm going to just move ahead. So this is how you set the headers. Okay, so question from Bala. Send redirect. Can you please elaborate? So basically, you know, redirection is that you are saying to the client to go to another page. I'm going to get some water, so hold a second. Okay, sorry about that. Mean to another server or to another page. It could be a page in another server. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. And body in HTTP response. So writing a response body is basically you are going to have an output stream object. Okay, so servlet always return response body, and response body could be either be print writer or servlet output stream. So you can use either. Okay, so we have seen examples of getting print writer, so that's for character-based output, and the servlet output stream is for binary image data. Okay, so typically we see print writer. Okay, moving forward. Yeah, so the things, I'm actually kind of moving forward a bit faster in previous slides because those are mostly reference purpose. Okay, so now these are more important topics like a scope object. So here I'm going to slow down a bit and explain things in a bit more detail. So what is a scope object? Scope object enables sharing information among collaborating web components. By the way, whenever I say web component, I'm talking about either servlet or JSP. Okay, so we haven't talked about JSP for now, so you know, you can just consider collaborating servlets for now. Via attributes maintained in scope object. Okay, so we are going to see types of scope object in the following slide. So basically you are going to save name object pairs or key value pairs as an attribute. Okay, and depending on which scope object you are saving this attribute, the collaborated operation could be impacted. So we'll see examples of that in a few minutes. So the attributes are maintained in scope object through these two methods. Get attributes, so you are getting an attribute, providing the name of the attribute, and you are getting the value. And if you want to set it, then you're going to call set attribute. Okay, there are 4 scope objects: web context, session, and request, and page. So this page scope is for JSP. So we are going to talk about this page scope when we talk about JSP. So we are going to cover these 3 different scope objects. So when you are saving an attribute in web context scope, this is the biggest scope, and we call it sometimes servlet context scope. So whatever you save in web context scope object will be available to any servlet or JSP on that application. When you're saving an attribute into session scope object, then attributes maintained in session scope object will be accessible the servlets or JSPs that belong to a single session. Okay. By the way, whenever I say a session or single session, I'm talking about you can think of a single user. Okay, so maybe a single browser. So the difference is that suppose this if you are saving an attribute in web context, you could have two different users, okay, accessing that attribute. They should be able to access that attribute. Now, if you're saving an attribute in session, then an attribute maintained in one user's session object, attribute maintained in first user's session scope object will not be accessible by second user. Okay. If you're saving an attribute in request, and then that attribute will be available only during the period that request is being handled. Okay, and page is per page basis. So we are going to cover these three things in a bit more detail, and we are going to exercise using the lab exercise. We are going to exercise these things, playing around with the hands-on lab exercises. So these four scope objects are represented by these classes: servlet context object representing web context scope object, session scope object is HTTP session object, and request is HTTP servlet request, which we know, and page is page context. Again, let's focus on these three. Okay, so let's talk about web context, which is sometimes called the servlet context. So what is a servlet context for? So it's used by servlet to set and get context-wide, meaning application-wide attributes. So as I said before, the attributes maintained in servlet context should be able to be accessible by multiple users because these are application-wide context objects. Okay. You also use servlet context to get what is called the request dispatcher. So in order to forward to another servlet or to include the result of another servlet or JSP, you have to get request dispatcher. Again, we are going to talk about this one later on in a bit more detail. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about here, that's perfectly fine. You can also have some initialization values, that initialization parameters set in context-wide in web.xml file. Again, we are going to talk about these things later on in a bit more detail, so don't worry about this for now. So for now, I want you to remember, because we are talking about the scope object, I want you to just remember the attributes maintained in servlet context scope object is available in application-wide. So they are available to all clients talking to that application. Okay, so basically servlet context objects are also functioning as a way of creating request, dispatch object, and things like that. But for now, don't worry about these things because we are going to talk about these topics later on. Okay, scope of servlet context, as we talked about, is context-wide scope, meaning whatever attributes you maintain servlet context will be shared by all servlets and JSP pages for that application. So that's the reason we call it application-wide scope. So as we talked about before, a web application is a collection of servlets and content installed on the specific subset of the server's URL namespace and possibly installed in a WAV file. So basically, a typical web application will have multiple servlets or JSPs and they all can access attributes maintained in servlet context scope object. So there is only one servlet context scope object per application because that is the per application scope object. Okay, so here each application has a single servlet context scope object, and these different clients they can access the attributes maintained by servlet context object because the attributes maintained in servlet context objects are application-wide. Okay, so how to access servlet context object? So you are going to call get servlet context method. Okay, so in your servlet code, you're going to just call get servlet context object. Okay, so this is basically a method from the HTTP servlet. We haven't talked about the servlet filter yet. So inside the servlet filter, sometimes you need to access servlet context object. Again, you can call get servlet context method. So this is actually maintained inside servlet config object. Okay, so this is not really even, you don't really have to understand this. Okay, so somehow servlet context object is created, maintained by the servlet container. That's all you have to know. So the way that you are going to get an attribute maintained in servlet context scope object is you are going to get the servlet context object by calling get servlet context method. Again, this is a method from this HTTP servlet class. And then you're going to call get attribute, and then you provide the name of the attribute. And what gets returned is object instance, object type, so you have to cast it to the type that you want. Okay, let's move on to session. We are going to talk about the concept of session tracking later on in another topic, okay? But here we are going to focus on more or less session as a scope object. So HTTP session scope object is a smaller scope than servlet context scope object. So in HTTP session scope object, you are maintaining attributes that are available in servlets and JSP participating in a single session. Okay. So typically HTTP session is used to maintain client state across a series of requests from a same user. So for example, online shopping cart. So if a user is using an online shopping cart, meaning if the user is actually shopping something on online site, whatever items that customer has added need to be maintained, right? So online shopping cart is maintained in session HTTP session scope object as an attribute. Okay. The reason that we have to maintain this online shopping cart is because HTTP itself is a stateless, meaning HTTP protocol does not maintain any state information, meaning it does not carry any the items that are purchased by the user. So we have to do it in ourselves, and we do that through HTTP session object. And this online shopping cart object will be maintained as an attribute in HTTP session scope object. So HTTP session maintains a client state in the form of attribute in HTTP session scope object. So you probably have online shopping cart object as an attribute. So here the servlets are using this these attributes maintained in HTTP session scope object to get and set the values of that session. So how to get HTTP session object? You are going to call get session method of the request object. So you are going to have the request object that is passed to you will be used to get the session object by calling get session method. Okay, so here from the request object you get the session object. So you got the HTTP session object, and then you can get the attribute of the cart. So suppose this cart attribute is actually set before. So every time new item is added to the cart, it will be set. It will be added to this cart attribute. Okay. So in order to get the shopping cart, before you add an item, you have to get this cart attribute by calling get attribute method of the session object. And once you got the shopping cart object, you can add it, new item to it. And then you're going to save it again by calling set attribute, so that next the item can be added later on. And you can also maybe compute the total price of the items that user has purchased. Alright, so let's actually do these demos. let's start with context scope. So again, this is the same application. So in this context scope, let's run the application first. So we are maintaining so let's say just whatever name you entered and submit. So here, basically these information, the name of the city, city attribute and age attributes are maintained in the in context session scope object. Okay. So let's see the code, and then I'm going to create another client and access. Well, let's actually create another client. I'm going to actually run another browser, in this case simulating another client. Okay, so they are accessing the same application, but because this information is maintained in application scope, the second user can access the data. Okay, so it knows Boston and 22. So let's see how it is maintained. Okay. So reading servlet. So what we have done is not this. Yeah, here we go. So we created. We actually get a servlet context object by calling get servlet method. Get servlet context method of the request object, and then we set the value, the city to Boston. Okay. So this is done in the first the servlet. And then we are setting another one. Here we are setting the age of 22 in the second servlet. Okay. Now these two attributes are now maintained as attribute in the servlet context scope, so you can actually access those things. Okay. Now let's try the session. So we are trying. In this case, let's try the run the application. So now we are actually saving this information into a session scope object. Okay. So let's say again type X. Now I can get the Boston and 22. Now if I try to access this same thing, let's see, I'm going to access this information from another user. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, good. Now you can see here this one. The second one is actually accessible, but the first one is not accessible. Okay, so let's see why there is a case. Okay, so in this case we have the first servlet. So we are saving this guy into a HTTP session object Boston. Okay, and then we are saving the next one into again the session object. So now age and age and city, both attributes are maintained in the session object. Now we are going to display these things in the response servlet. Okay, so here this is the way that we are actually accessing the session object. Okay, so as you can see, the first one is not accessible, but I'm trying to see why the age is in fact accessible. Let's see why that is the case. I expect even that should not be accessible because it's a completely different session. The reason is because so this one cannot access. Why age is accessible? Oh, I see. So this is accessible because it's actually calling greeting 2. So it's actually calling its own version. So it's calling, servlet 2, so it's actually setting its own, in this case, this is servlet 2, right? It's actually setting its own thing. So it's actually accessing the, because he has his own session object, and in his own session, it's actually, the saving 22. Okay, so this 22 is actually from his own session object, and this is not from the first user. The reason the first one is not accessible is because we are skipping the greeting. So, you know, in this first name, so this one was never invoked. Okay, so that's the reason this one has never been saved in the second user's session object. Okay, all right, so that is session. Now let's see the request. Okay, so in this case, we are saving the attribute in the request scope object. So here we are saving again city and Boston, and the saving and age. Okay, so and then we are trying to display all these things. So now let's try to run this application. So again, if you type whatever name and submit, you can see. Now look at this. So it doesn't take the so it is actually per request scope, meaning it will be saved only for for that request. Okay, so here again we are trying to access the greeting too, so that's the reason you can access this guy, because this is saved on that particular requested scope object, but this is not visible. Okay, even though this is from a same user, this one is actually saved, meaning the greeting servlet, this one is maintained only in this request attribute scope. Okay, so that's the reason it's not visible. So as you can see, depending on where you save your attribute, they could be accessible in different scope. Okay, so hopefully you got the idea. All right, moving forward. Init parameters. So you can set the parameter name and value as initialization parameter. So it's like you're setting attribute in servlet context. So this is the application context. So I am actually saving city and Seoul and age 22. So instead of actually calling set attribute to save these things into servlet context scope object, I can just initialize things like this. Okay. All right, and then I can access those values not by calling get attribute, but by calling get init parameters. So here I can call get init parameter, providing the name of the parameter, same thing with the age, and then you should be able to access it. Again, because this is saved in application servlet context scope, any servlet should be able to access it. In fact, any user should be able to access them. This is a case that you are setting a parameters per servlet basis. Okay, so this is basically you're saving this parameter and value, basically attribute, the name of the attribute and value of the attribute in servlet context. Okay, so this is like a request. The servlet scope. Okay, so again, this greeting tool is saved only for servlet, and this one is only for this servlet. So this servlet, greeting servlet, can access this value, but it cannot access these init parameters of another servlet, vice versa. So greeting servlet 2 can access its own init parameter values, but it cannot access of another servlet. All right, so greeting servlet init parameters. So you can just call get init parameter and provide the name of the parameter. Again, this it should be able to access only the init parameters for that particular servlet. Okay, so let's try init param context and init param servlet exercise. So okay, so in this case, init param context, we are setting the in web.xml file. So I'm gonna display XML. So here we define the city, Seoul, and age 22. Okay, and then we are going to access those things. So let's see where we are accessing it. So we are not accessing it here, and yeah, we're accessing in the response servlet file. So here I'm going to call get init parameter and provide the key name of city, and same thing over here. So if I run this application, I should be able to access like this. Okay, so type G whatever, and you can see it is accessible because again it is actually for application basis. I can call these things from another browser representing another user, and I should be able to access those values. Okay, so in 22. Okay, now the next one is servlet. So in this case, again, if you take a look at the web.xml file, here you see XML file, and this time the init parameters is per servlet basis. So this one is for greeting servlet, and this one is for greeting servlet 2, and this one is for response servlet. So each of the servlet has its own init parameters. Now let's try to access these things. So again, in our response servlet code, we are accessing from servlet context init parameter. We are basically accessing those things. Okay, so let's try to see which one is accessible. So let's run the application. Okay, so it accessing the init parameters. So here, let's see. Let's see. I was expecting that servlet context. Oh, okay. So I think I was looking at the wrong code. So, let's see whether this is a code. And I should actually change this one to like this, because I want to actually read the servlet parameters, not actually oh, okay. So yeah, so this one I was actually reading from a servlet context object. This one, yeah, I was actually trying to show this. Okay, so if you try to de-access these things, oh yeah, so this one is not relevant. Yeah, so that's the reason I was a little bit confused. We can even actually take these two guys out because they are context related things. Okay, so here we are accessing the basically the greeting 3, which is response servlet init parameters. Okay, so here when we are calling this guy, and I'm actually accessing only the init parameters of response servlet, and there is no way that I can access the other servlet's init parameters because I don't have an access. Okay, all right, so that hopefully give you a sense of how things work. Okay, handling errors. So basically a web container generates a default error message, but you can create a custom default page to be displayed instead. And now the way that you can handle errors is that you can create error page for error conditions, and then you're going to modify web.xml file accordingly. So let's see an example. Suppose for this error condition, I want this page to be displayed. And for this particular error condition, I want to display this page. And again, for this error condition, I want to display this page. So that's basically what you do. So let's do the error handling demo. So here, so let's run the application to see how things work. So in this case, if I don't enter anything, then it will generate. It will actually go to name not entered error HTML page. So let's take a look at that. So first of all, let's take a look at the web.xml file. So in web.xml file, what we have done is providing error conditions. So whenever there is this name not entered exception, we want to display this name not entered HTML file. So if you take a look at the name not entered HTML file, it's just a simple HTML file, just displaying this message. Okay, so let's take a look at the code of error generation. So if you go to, so we have actually this exception class called the name not entered exception. It's basically extension of servlet exception. It doesn't do anything. So in our case, in greeting servlet 2.java file, when nothing has been entered, then we are basically throwing that name not entered exception. Okay, now because we actually specify for this exception, we want to display this HTML page, that's what happens. All right. Okay, now request dispatcher, whenever you want to add, so that is actually concept of forwarding and including, and we are going to talk about this concept in a bit more detail when we talk about JSP later on. So when you forward, basically you do some processing and then you are going to pass the control to that forwarded servlet. Okay, so that forwarded servlet is responsible for creating a response message. When you're doing include, for example, in this case you're doing include, then you're basically calling this servlet represented by this URL, and whatever result will be returned to you, and then you are still responsible for creating response message. So in this case, in order to do either forwarding or include, you have to create response dispatcher object, and the way that you are going to create response dispatcher object is from a session. You call, well, first of all, you get the servlet context object, and then you're going to call get request dispatcher, and then you provide the URL of either included or forwarded the servlet, and then once you got that dispatcher object, then you're going to either say include or forward. So in this case, we are including it, meaning we are going to call this servlet, okay, represented by /banner, and whatever result will be included in the final response. Okay, so let's do that. So in this case, we are going to do include. So include, we are going to, let's see, so we are going to just run the application, and then we're going to take a look at the code. So basically it includes a banner.html. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. So let's take a look at the web.xml file. So, since we are dealing with the servlet, we created another servlet called greeting. Okay, so we didn't actually create the servlet. We actually basically just using banner.html. So we're not even creating a servlet. So basically, we want to include whatever result of banner.html in our final response message. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. So in our case, in response servlet, basically, and let's see. Oh, this is the one. So what it does is that this is a servlet, okay, that in fact actually is including two. So it's actually including the result of calling response, okay, and it also includes let's see, it also includes the banner HTML, so that is actually being included. Let's wait, it's actually being, oh, here we go. Okay, so we also actually include banner. So in this case, when we do not, well, so in this case, the first servlet, okay, when something is entered, it's going to include the result of calling response servlet. So in this case, it's going to call the response servlet because this is URL matching with the servlet. When there is nothing is actually entered, then we are basically including banner servlet. So this is the first time this servlet is being invoked, and it's just displaying banner servlet. We just call this banner servlet. I'm sorry, it's not a servlet, sorry about that, banner.html, and that will be included. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense of how this servlet works. Logging is basically you can call, in order to do some logging, you're going to call log method of the servlet context object. Okay, so you can see servlet context object is actually used for various purposes, right? Alright, so let's try that servlet context exercise. So here we are basically doing some logging, and let's run the application, and we are going to see some logging. So whatever, and submit, and then we are going to see in the glassfish. You can see these are the logging messages coming from the servlet, greeting servlet 2, and greeting response servlet. So if you take a look at the code, each servlet basically is calling log method of servlet context object, and it's just being displayed the system log. Okay, so that is pretty much what I have in mind for this presentation.